With the newest Pokemon TCG expansion, Brilliant Stars, set to release this February, today I'm going to give you my full set review to get you up to speed on all of the most promising new cards that are going to be coming out in this set. And trust me when I say this is not going to be a set you want to miss.
Ha! Never heard that one before.
No, seriously, I know most sets have something to get excited for usually, but Brilliant Stars really does look to be one of the most impactful sets that we've seen in months, with new attackers, powerful new support Pokemon, some insane trainer cards, all making Brilliant Stars look, well, brilliant, quite frankly. Now, the big hook here, of course, is going to be the introduction of the powerful new Pokemon VSTAR cards. They might not have as much HP as their VMAX siblings, but they only give up 2 prize cards and come with these powerful one-time use VSTAR powers that can quickly change the course of a match. I know these cards are going to be very sought after, so if you are looking to pick up any for yourself or any other cards from the set, just a heads up, I do have an affiliate link in the description with tcgplayer.com that you can use where they are already taking pre-orders. And any purchases made do come back around and help support the channel. No pressure though, guys. If you want an easier way at showing your support, you can always just tap that like button to help feed the always hungry YouTube algorithm. But as you may have guessed by the length of today's video, we have quite a few cards that we need to talk about, so let's stop wasting time. I'll have timestamps pinned to the top of the comment section, that way you can jump to any card you want to hear about. But with that being said, let's jump in and check out what Brilliant Stars has in store for us. So we're going to kick things off today with a new Stage 2 Pokemon. We have Torterra. And before we get to Torterra, I actually do want to briefly highlight Grotle. I think is a really solid Stage 1 that we have here. Has this ability, you may search your deck for a grass Pokemon or reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. And this actually really does pair nicely with the attack on Torterra. Torterra is going to be a beefy Stage 2 Pokemon with 190 HP, 4 retreat cost, fire weakness, but it has this first attack for a grass and colorless, does 50 for each of your evolution Pokemon in play. You can use your Grottles to search out Pokemon throughout the game, and you just swarm a bunch of evolutions in play, hit for a ton of damage. So if your entire field is full of evolutions, that's going to be 300 damage, and with the new choice belt that we're getting in the set, that actually puts Torterra at 330 damage, which is admittedly really strong for just a one prize Stage 2 Pokemon like this. Now, while that sounds good on paper, setting up just a single Stage 2 can sometimes be an issue for decks, let alone having every single Pokemon on your field be an evolution. And on top of that, if your opponent knocks out one of your evolutions, well, you can't get your evolution back into play that same turn. You have to put down, for example, another Turtwig and wait a turn before you can start evolving. And at that point, your damage cap is around 250 to 280 damage, which is still a decent number, don't get me wrong, that can one-shot Pokemon VSTAR. But if you do want to get around that, you are going to need the help of other cards like the new Empoleon, or there's even a Beedrill Stone format that can cheat itself into play. But there is a part of me that likes this card, guys. I don't think this attack is too difficult to get powered up. Of course, we have things like Raihan, but we still have cards like Cherim as well, which you can have on your board to do more damage. And of course, throw down extra grass energy to help get your attackers powered up. I was really torn on a rating for this card, but I think ultimately I am going to just slightly choose to downvote this card. I think Torterra is pretty easy to get up and running, but I think the issue is ensuring that every single Pokemon on your field is an evolution. That just seems like a lot to ask for in a style of deck like this that struggles just to get even a couple evolutions into play usually. Between that and the high number of Pokemon that you're going to have to run, I really do worry that's going to eat too much into this deck's consistency. Next up, we have a trio of Stage 1 Pokemon. That's going to be the new Wormadam cards. So each of these Pokemon, very similar. They all have this same interesting first attack and then a, to be honest, a relevant second attack that is a little bit different on each of them. But the big draw is that they are all different types. So in theory, you could play each of these into some sort of toolbox to hit for the right weaknesses against certain decks out there. But if we take a look at this first attack, for 2 colorless energy, it does 30 plus 10 more for each Pokemon in your discard pile. This is essentially a spiritual reprint of the old Vespiquen from many sets ago at this point, which was one of the strongest cards in its respective format for the longest time, even in recent years in the expanded format. And I've got to be honest, Brilliant Stars actually does a good bit to help a deck like this. We're getting a reprint of Ultra Ball to help pitch away Pokemon into the discard pile, and we're also getting double turbo energy to ensure that we have some extra energies beyond just 4 twin energy. I think there's actually a handful of good Pokemon that you could even run alongside this thing. Of course, Cinccino's going to be one of the biggest ones because it does help speed up your deck and allows you to pitch away Pokemon in the process. But also I think this could be a really good partner for Zoroark. You don't mind discarding extra copies of Zoroark if you don't need it, but also having 1 to 2 on your field means that you can always use its ability to get back out the correct Wormadam out of the discard pile at any given point. I think the grass and fighting Wormadams that we have probably hit for the best weaknesses, But there is one thing I think the Metal Wormadam really has going in its favor, and that's access to Galarian Berserker and Galarian Meowth. Galarian Meowth already very solid because you can use its ability to discard cards from your hand to find your Berserkers, and your Berserker afterwards can increase your damage output a little bit more. So I think there's actually a few different ways you could theoretically take this deck. You could play more of a toolbox style of deck, or I think you could lean a little bit more heavily on the metal type to be able to have access to these damage buffs. And speaking of damage, I think that is just generally my big issue with this collection of cards. Vespiquen was in a format where the most popular Pokemon capped out right over 200 HP. And if we compare that to today's format, now we have Pokemon that cap out over 300. Now, I know Pokemon VSTAR are going to be a little bit less tanky, but I still just don't think the base damage from this attack really has sort of scaled correctly over the years. And that does concern me when it comes to potentially taking one-hit KOs. But guys, I'm going to remain a little bit neutral on Wormadam just due to the sheer toolbox nature and all of the support that Brilliant Stars is delivering us alongside them. So up next, we finally have our first V-Star of the set review. That's going to be Shaymin V and V-Star. So first, let's actually take a look at the base form Shaymin V, mainly for the second attack for a grass and colorless energy to 60 plus 40 more for each prize card your opponent has already taken. So Shaymin is no stranger to having these revenge style attacks. There is the Shaymin EX back from Next Destinies that at one point actually did become, I'd say, a staple of certain decks in the format for this same style of effect. And if we just run through the math here, if our opponent has taken 5 prize cards, we're going to be capping out at 260 damage, excluding any damage modifiers. That's going to knock out basically any Pokemon V-Star in the format outside of Arceus. But let's take a look at the V-Star. It does get a boost up to 250 HP, still has a 1 retreat and fire weakness, and its first attack is actually kind of similar here. Same exact attack, same attack cost, but instead of 60 base damage, it's 120, which now moves Shaymin V-Star's damage cap up to 320 damage. And now that's actually within one-shot range of quite a few Pokemon VMAX that are in the format. But then taking a look at Shaymin's V-Star power, it has this ability. You may use this ability during your turn, heal 120 from each of your grass Pokemon, and you can't use more than 1 V-Star power in a game. So I actually am not really very impressed by this V-Star power. There's not too many grass decks running around as it is. I think the big one in recent memory has been Leafeon VMAX. And while this could help against certain decks like Jolteon or Rapid Strike Urshifu, I think other cards like the new Manaphy kind of fill a similar role, and that potentially opens you up to using the ability on Leafeon V-Star as your V-Star power for the game. Now, getting back to this attack, I actually do think this attack is very, very good. But my issue is that this is an evolution. The big upside to cards in the past, like Shaymin EX with these revenge style attacks, is their ability to just be slapped down, powered up in a single turn, and take a huge knockout. Being an evolution kind of takes that away from Shaymin V-Star. Your opponent has a turn to be able to chase that thing down with a boss's orders and pick it off. Now, of course, not every time that's going to happen, but it just makes pulling off this combo a lot more inconsistent. You're taking up 2 deck spaces instead of 1. Your opponent is getting an extra turn to respond to this combo. And again, guys, for this discussion, we've been assuming up till this point our opponent has taken 5 prize cards. Your opponent isn't always going to do that. So Shaymin V-Star, I think I am going to ultimately vote down, but I will say I think Shaymin V does have a chance to see some play. It's just an Aurora Energy plus a Raihan away from being able to be splashed into certain decks. And as we get more and more Pokemon V-Star, I think this attack plus Choice Belt ends up making this card the more valuable of the two that we have here today. Next up, we have a brand new Zarude V. This is going to be a basic Pokemon V with 220 HP, 2 retreat cost, fire weakness, and 2 different attacks. The first one's definitely a bit of a throwback for us. For a single grass energy, it does 30, and then 30 to one of your opponent's bench Pokemon. And then its second attack for 2 grass and a colorless does 120, plus 120 more if your opponent's active is a Pokemon V. So like I said, the first attack is very nostalgic. This is the same attack that we've seen in the past on very strong Pokemon like Buzzwole GX or Landorus EX prior to that. And Zarude V here is attempting to carry the tradition forward, but as you can tell by my rating, I'm a little bit skeptical personally. While this could allow you some early game pressure and threaten some cheap KOs on things like Sobbles, we don't have quite as many low HP evolving single prize Pokemon in the format right now. And with Brilliant Stars giving us Manaphy to protect bench Pokemon is something else we do have to kind of factor in here. But nevertheless, I actually do still like this attack. And this is definitely one of those cards I think as we start to drift away from Pokemon VMAX in favor of Pokemon V-Star, This actually could progressively become a better card. If we can use this first attack to soften up some evolving Pokemon V, maybe on the first turn or so of the game, we can come in with this second attack to clean up those knockouts, because 240, while a decent number already, is just shy of a one-shot on Pokemon VSTAR, so this first attack does fix our math a little bit. Between that and Choice Belt, we should be able to pretty easily deal with Pokemon VSTAR running around. But even though my rating does look a bit negative here, I do think this card does have a ton of support. Obviously, we can play this with Rillaboom to help get set up, and with us being a basic attacker instead of a VMAX partner for Rillaboom, I don't think it's actually going to be too hard to get this thing set up and running. I think it's going to be one of those cards where it's not that it's bad, it's just the format right now isn't positioned in a way that plays to its strengths. So definitely could be a card with some long-term potential. Next up, we're going to be talking about everyone's favorite Gen 1 fire starter. That, of course, is going to be Charizard VSTAR. And we are getting a new Charizard V alongside this, which I actually do think could be the preferred one going forward, since it does have an attack for 2 fire energy and a colorist is 90, and you discard any tools on your opponent's active. Nothing groundbreaking, but this is, I think, slightly better than the other one back from Darkness Ablaze. But Charizard VSTAR, getting into this guy, 280 HP, water weakness, and a 2 retreat cost. Having 2 retreat cost is actually really nice on Charizard. Historically, this is a kind of a chunky Pokemon with a heavy retreat cost, and being able to guarantee the air balloon can get you onto the bench to use Magma Basin is something I think is nice about the way they designed this card. But looking at its attacks, it has 2 here. The first one for 2 fire and a colorist is 130, plus 100 more if this Pokemon has any damage counters on it. And then its V-Star power is going to be an attack for 3 fire and a colorist, does 320, and you discard 2 energy from this Pokemon. So of course, Charizard VSTAR is kind of leading the charge here of all of the new fire support that we're getting in Brilliant Stars. Both these attacks on the VSTAR do have their own uses. With this first attack with the Choice Belt, you can pretty easily deal with most Pokemon VSTAR in the format. And with this second attack, it pretty much guarantees us a one-shot on any VMAXs as well. Now, typically in the past, these attacks that require you to have damage counters on you do wind up being kind of gimmicky and inconsistent to pull off, but again, we have the new Magma Basin Stadium card coming out in the set that accelerates energy to our benched fire Pokemon and puts damage counters on them in the process. And even though fire hasn't really been that good ever since Welder rotated, we have a plethora of fire Pokemon just waiting to be dusted off now that we have some energy acceleration for them. This guy is going to have no shortage of potential backup attackers, but I think my big reservation for a card like this is the attack cost, because even though we are getting Magma Basin in this same set, I do think Magma Basin becomes less impactful once we start looking at pairing it with cards with over a 2 energy attack cost, because let's say our Charizard VSTAR gets knocked out. You know, if we're playing it with something like an Entei V or some other 1 or 2 energy attacker, all we have to do is attach return, accelerate energy with Magma Basin, and we're ready to go. But with a card like Charizard VSTAR, that is going to require additional methods of cheating energy in a play, whether it's something like Turbo Patch, EXP Share, or Raihan. We are going to need additional combo pieces, and with Magma Basin damaging our own Charizards, I think a lot of the time we're actually probably not going to be able to tank a hit with this thing. So I think because of that reservation, that does slightly curb my enthusiasm, and I'm going to remain a little bit neutral on this thing, but I'm kind of cautiously optimistic, dare I say, because I do think there is a lot of good support for Charizard, but I can't help but worry about the potential energy cost in conjunction with its lack of tankability. But if nothing else, I will say this is more playable than Charizard VMAX for whatever that's worth. Next up, guys, we have another key fire Pokemon that we are getting in the set. That's going to be the brand new Moltres. Moltres is a very straightforward card here, very similar to the Hoopa that we have right now, or the Zapdos back from Team Up, but it's a basic fire Pokemon with 120 HP, 1 retreat cost, and 1 single attack for a fire energy just 20, plus 70 more if this Pokemon has any damage counters on it, and then this damage isn't affected by weakness. So one thing I actually really do like about Moltres is that it gives us a way at putting damage on the board while we're trying to get set up with potentially our Charizard, which of course is going to be one of the main partner Pokemon alongside this thing. So what I mean by that is you can attach for turn to your Charizard and then use Magma Basin to accelerate an energy to Moltres and start poking your opponent's active, setting up some 2-hit KOs on opposing Pokemon VMAX, or even outside of Pokemon VMAX, this is going to be able to pick off those low HP evolving basics like Sobbles, and maybe be able to steal you some easy prize cards while you're trying to get set up with your big, beefier attackers. I think Moltres is a slam dunk here. It's a very easy Pokemon to get set up. We have a ton of switching and discarding effects in the format, so it really should not be an issue to get this thing going, and being a single prize Pokemon also forces your opponent into a 7 prize game. So big thumbs up for me, love this card. Continuing our look at all of the fire support from Brilliant Stars, we have Entei V, which should actually look very familiar to another card we already have in standard format. But Entei V has 230 HP, 3 retreat, which that part is actually kind of annoying. Has that fleet-footed ability to allow us to draw a card if we're in the active spot, and has now the Burning Rondo attack to do 20 plus 20 more for each bench Pokemon in play, both yours and your opponent's. It goes without saying, Suicune V has proven itself to be a very strong card in the format up until now. And similarly, I think Entei V really makes a strong case for itself. You can kind of see the trade-off that they've made for this card compared to Suicune. You gain some extra HP, but you also gain a beefier retreat cost in the process, which actually is kind of annoying because fire Pokemon are so reliant on being able to freely move to the bench to accelerate energy with Magma Base, and having that 3 energy retreat cost is honestly a bummer. And then even beyond that, I will say, even though at face value Entei does have 230 HP, if you do want to accelerate energy with Magma Basin, well, you're knocking your HP basically back down to the same range that Suicune has anyway. So effectively, we've gained a retreat cost with this card. But nevertheless, these attributes are still really good. Entei, of course, has a different toolbox of Pokemon that it can pull from to play alongside itself, whereas Suicune has things like Ice Rider, Entei V has things like Charizard VSTAR, Moltres, maybe even things like Victini VMAX if you want to sort of copy the same template of Suicune. And since we are getting all 3 legendary dogs represented after Brilliant Stars, I think there is actually even a world where you could play some sort of toolbox deck with things like Aurora Energy and Melony to be able to use any of the legendary dogs for specific matchups. That seems like a cool deck idea that could be worth exploring, but I think the more likely one is going to be Entei V seeing play alongside some of the other fire Pokemon we just looked at. And one thing I do like about Entei specifically in the context of these fire attackers that we've seen is that its attack cost sits very nicely in between that of Moltres and of your Charizard V-Star. As we discussed when talking about Charizard, I think a lot of the times it is going to be a challenge to get 3 energies out of nowhere on one of your fire attackers. Well, guess what? You have a solid 2 energy attacker that you can easily get powered up instead to still hit for honestly a pretty respectable amount of damage. I think the jury is still out in terms of what counts Entei is going to see play in. Like, is this going to be more of a backup attacker for Charizard decks, or are we going to see something closer to what we've seen with Suicune, where Entei tends to be the main attacker? But either way, I'm very enthusiastic for Entei V. Suicune has been great. Entei has a similar amount of support, so big thumbs up for me. Now here's where some of my enthusiasm for the fire cards in the set does start to dwindle a little bit. We have a new Semi-Seer V. This is going to be another basic fire Pokemon, and it has this attack for a fire energy just 20, and you may attach up to 2 basic energies from your hand to your Pokemon in any way that you like. And then its other attack for a fire and 2 colors does 90 plus 30 more for each energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. So we'll come back to this first attack, but really quickly, I just kind of want to take the idea that we're ever going to use this second attack and just kind of throw it out the door. If we run through the math, most attackers right now have anywhere between a 2 and 3 energy attack cost. If they do have a 3 energy attack cost, you're going to be hitting for 180, which is not horrible. But if we compare this to other similar fire Pokemon, like Talonflame V, or Ninetales V, or even the Entei V that we just looked at, which attacks for 2 energy, this thing is really not adding any extra value to your fire decks. But the first attack at least does make somewhat of an argument to be made. Charizard V-Star does have a huge attack cost, and any additional energy that we can cheat and play is definitely going to be welcome. So I think if we were to attempt to play a card like this, I think you're better off just playing something like Victini V, because it accelerates 3 energy. It has a solid 2 energy attack and has the option to evolve as well. There's just too many other solid fire Pokemon in the format to really consider using this thing. So going to be a hard pass for me on Semi-Seer. So for our first water Pokemon of the set review, we have Kingler VMAX, which, side note, I think is kind of cool. Kingler really never gets interesting cards, so it is kind of nice for the Kingler fans out there, however many that might be. They finally get an ultra rare of one of their favorite Pokemon. So that is kind of nice. But unfortunately, that's kind of where my enthusiasm for this card ends. Let's check out this evolution line. Kingler V actually is very relevant for this discussion as well. For a water energy, you flip a coin. If heads, search your deck for up to 5 water energy cards and attach them to your Pokemon in any way that you like. Then shuffle your deck. Then does have another attack for 2 water and a colorless, does 200 and takes 30 damage. But then looking ahead to Kingler VMAX, this thing has 330 HP, lightning weakness, a massive 3 retreat cost, and 2 kind of similar attacks to what we just looked at. The first one for, again, just a single water energy does the exact same thing of Kingler V. You search your deck for up to 5 water energy cards, attach them any way that you like, but now you no longer have to flip a coin. And then its other attack, 2 water and a colorless does 240, and again, we take 30 damage in the process. So I do kind of like, just design-wise, the theme of these cards, where the Kingler V has these effects and then the VMAX version basically has these juiced up versions of the same effects. But my issue is I want this first attack from the VMAX on Kingler V. Because guys, this is the type of attack we really want to use on turn 1. Starting with turn 2, if we're a multi-prize deck, we want to be getting damage on the board, not using an attack like this to get set up. Other water decks could play something like Frostmoth and be attacking turn 2, or in the case of Melanie decks, be attacking turn 1. And conceding that we're not going to do damage till turn 3 is something I cannot get behind at all. So much like in the case of the Shaman VSTAR we looked at a little bit earlier, I think the evolution here, not that great, but I do think there is some degree of hope for the base Kingler V. You do have to remember, we do currently have Glimwood Tangle still in the format, which will allow us to reflip our coins. So again, if we do use this in flip tails, we do have a chance at pulling this off, and being able to accelerate 5 energy is honestly really solid. If we can pull this off, that basically means we don't have to run Frostmoth in our deck at all, which is great. Being able to just slap down a basic, have all of our energy set up for the rest of the game, count me in. But I think the issue that Kingler V runs into is that since you're already having to play Glimwood Tangle probably in a 4 count to find it turn 1, you basically are conceding you're not playing any other stadiums, and you almost have to build your deck around other water Pokemon that can make use of Glimwood Tangle, as to make sure that it's not a dead card for the rest of the game. And luckily, there are a couple of water Pokemon I will at least shout out here. We do still have both Wailord V and Dreadnought VMAX in the format. Between Kingler V, your attachments per turn, and potentially Melanie as well, these Pokemon should be able to reliably stay set up throughout the course of a game. But guys, I gotta be honest with you, I don't feel like basing my whole water deck off of this coin flip attack. I think most of the time, Suicune V can get up and running as soon as turn 1, especially after Ultra Ball comes out in this set. And while some of these coin flip attackers pictured on screen can be a bit tankier, I think I'd rather just stick with tried and true favorites like Suicune and Ice Rider Calyrex. Next up, we have the other Sinnoh starter that we're going to talk about in this set review, and that is going to be Empoleon. And I gotta say, guys, this card really bums me out. I'm not going to lie. I'll explain why in a second. But this thing is a stage 2, of course, 160 HP, lightning weakness, and a 2 retreat cost. And it has this very interesting ability once during your turn. If this card is in your discard pile and you have no cards in your hand, you can play this card onto your bench and draw 3 cards. And then it has one single attack for a water energy to 60 to one of your opponent's Pokemon. Okay, so as much as I like this ability, this attack just kills the playability of a card like this. Now, yes, you of course can play Empoleon in decks that don't plan on attacking with Empoleon, and just use this as sort of like a last resort way of drawing cards if you wind up being in a rough spot. With things like Quick Ball and Ultra Ball coming back into the format, it's not going to be hard to get Empoleon in the discard pile, or even potentially play down your hand low enough to use this ability. But I really don't think there's too many decks where this is a desperately needed effect. One of the big ones that comes to mind is going to be the Torterra that we did look at a little bit earlier in this set review. But beyond that, I think the only other decks that might ever think about this would be decks that are playing something like Rose or Peony, where you have to dump your whole hand. But I think there's just other better ways at doing that. We have the new Bibarel that's coming out in this set. We have other things like Kricketune V that already do the same thing as a basic that doesn't have this awkward ability that you have to play around. And at that point, the only option left is to really think about Empoleon as an attacker, and this attack is just nowhere near good enough. I really do wish this card had been designed in a way that made this a solid single prize attacker, and then this ability just kind of helped you cheat these Empoleons throughout the course of a game to ensure that you could keep attacking. I think that would have been a much better way at designing this, and is sure to be one of the cards that is going to appear in my redesigned 5-card series whenever I get around to doing an entry for Brilliant Stars. So yeah, this card is a huge letdown. The ability does have some potential promise, but right now I don't see the need. Next up, we have Floatzel. Floatzel is going to be a new Stage 1 Pokemon that Control players are going to be very happy to see. It has 110 HP, which does put it outside of level ball range, which is a little bit unfortunate, but has also a 1 retreat cost, lightning weakness, and then its first attack is really the main one here. For a water energy, you put 2 item cards from your discard pile into your hand. Control is definitely gaining a little bit of a buff after this set, but yeah, we're no stranger to this effect. This is the same effect that we saw on Sableye back from Dark Explorers. Now, of course, Sableye was a basic Pokemon instead of being a stage 1, but I will actually say Sableye existed in a format that was dominated by basic Pokemon that could attack literally on turn 1 of the game going first, and still saw success. So even though this is a stage 1, I do think the format is a little bit slower compared to when Sableye initially came out, which might all work out in the long run. But yeah, there's no shortage of great item cards that we can get back. I think one of the main ones that comes to mind is going to be cards like Crushing Hammer to just continually remove our opponent's energy, and then also gusting effects like Cross Switcher or Pokemon Catcher to attempt to trap something in the active spot. And while this won't allow us to get back any of our disruption-based supporter cards like Team Yellgrunt or Flannery, just as an example, we can get back cards like Palpad, which then in turn can retrieve those supporter cards. You guys might have heard me say this before, but I'm not the biggest control player, so I'm probably not going to be the one that breaks Floatzel, but I still think we should probably take this card seriously. Sableye has seen a ton of success in the past. Likewise, Oranguru back from Ultra Prism also very, very dominant for control archetypes. I know these Pokemon I'm rattling off are basics, but right now my gut feeling is that there's too many quality controlling cards that we have in the format for this thing not to wind up being good. So fingers crossed that it doesn't wind up being a thing. I mean, control is just miserable to play against most of the time. But if you are a control player, Brilliant Stars is going to make you very, very happy, I think. Next up, we have one of the absolute standouts of Brilliant Stars, and that's going to be Lumineon V. Lumineon V is going to be the latest in a long line of multi-prize support Pokemon with strong coming into play abilities. But this thing says whenever you play this Pokemon from your hand onto your bench, you may search your deck for a supporter card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. Then it does have a single attack for a Water and 2 Colorless. Does 120, shuffle this Pokemon and all cards attached to it into your deck. This is effectively a reprint of Tapu Lele GX, or maybe a little bit more accurately, maybe Jirachi EX, just because Tapu Lele also saw play as an attacker, Jirachi did not. We're probably not attacking with Lumineon, but either way, the ability is the thing that all of these cards have in common, and they have historically been some of the best abilities in the game. And what I really love about this effect is that it gives a huge buff to non-draw based and tech supporters that you only usually want maybe 1-2 copies of in your deck at most. And prior to this card, it's typically a challenge to find them unless you're playing some sort of search engine like Inteleon. But for other decks that want to play something like a Raihan on the exact turn that you need it, well, it's going to be a little bit tougher for you most of the time. And with Lumineon coming out, that is definitely set to change. You know, think of something like a Boss's Orders as an example. Previously, you probably just played 3 Boss's Orders in your deck, and whenever you draw into them, you draw into them. But now you have 3 Boss's Orders, a Lumineon, 4 Quick Ball, and potentially 4 Ultra Ball in your deck. And if you're playing all of those, you now have around 12 outs to a Boss's Orders on any given turn compared to just the 3 that you would have had prior to this card coming out. Now, I know Eldegoss V has served kind of a similar role in the past and has kind of fallen out of favor, but I think Lumineon actually in a way is a little bit better because with Eldegoss, you have to get the supporter card that you want into the discard pile and then use Eldegoss to get it back out. Whereas Lumineon, you just need to play this and you can instantly find the card whenever you need it. This is going to make finding that late game boss a little bit easier, finding that mid game Raihan a little bit easier. Also makes playing those strong setup turn 1 supporters like the new Gloria or even Adventurer's Discovery a little bit more feasible as well. You will of course still have to contend with decks that are playing Path to the Peak, but Lumineon V is still an extremely solid card and now opens up a ton of supports to see play outside of decks that are playing the Inteleon engine. I will say up front, I don't believe Lumineon is going to be a 3 and 4 of like we saw with Tapu Lele GX, but rest assured this is certainly going to be at least a 1 of in a ton of decks out there. Continuing our streak of looking at strong water Pokemon, up next we have Manaphy. And guys, I cannot tell you how stoked I am we are getting this card. We're looking at this thing for this ability, prevent all damage done to your bench Pokemon by your opponent's attacks. And this is an effect we have been sorely missing ever since the Mew back from Unbroken Bonds rotated. You can even tell by looking at tournament results from this past year. We saw cards like Rapid Strike Urshifu VMAX continue to see a lot of play after the rotation, and cards like Jolteon VMAX really make a name for themselves in the later half of this year as well because of their ability to easily wreak havoc on your opponent's bench. And I think the lack of this bench protection has really most disproportionately been to the detriment of single prize decks. And you guys know me, my favorite style of deck is going to be evolving single prize deck, usually with these low HP basics that take multiple turns to get set up and usually give your opponent a lot of time to snipe your basics before you even really get going. And I actually want to highlight the 70 HP on this card as well. I think that could be something that some players might overlook, but the fact that this is 70 and not 60 means that things like Inteleon can't as easily snipe this. Had this been 60 HP, we could have even seen things like Medicham pop up to be able to go like 2 Inteleon snipes plus a Medicham to knock out your Manaphy, then immediately give your opponent a turn to snipe your bench. But 70 HP takes that option off the table. Now, of course, this is not going to protect against things like Dragapult VMAX, since damage counters are an effective in attack and not actual damage. But nevertheless, this offers a ton of decks some much needed protection, and I'm so excited to see this come into the game. Now, on a more sour note, we have a much less enticing water Pokemon. That's going to be Galarian Mr. Rime V. And this is actually going to be one of the only new battle style cards that we're getting in this set. It's going to be a new Fusion Strike Pokemon with 210 HP, Metal Weakness, 2 retreat cost, and 2 different attacks. The first one, for a water energy, you search your deck for up to 3 item cards and put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. And its other attack for 2 water and a colorless does 90 plus 90 more if this Pokemon has a Pokemon tool attached. So right out the gate, guys, I do not think we are attacking with Galarian Mr. Rime. I think more than likely, if this were to see play, this would basically just be a target for your Mew VMAX decks. In theory, at least, if we are attacking in this damage range, this at least gives us an option to hit for a similar amount of damage as Genesect V without the downside of not being able to attack on the following turn. Now, this card does have the restriction of needing a Pokemon tool card to be attached, but luckily we are getting the brand new Choice Belt, which assuredly is going to see widespread play. That bumps you up to 210 damage, and that's before anything like power tablets on top of that. Or instead of doing all that, we can just play a copy of Switch, which accomplishes literally the same thing and allows us to do more damage with Genesect's attack or maybe even Meloetta's on the next turn. Searching your deck for up to 3 item cards could be good, but most of the time that's not really an issue as the Fusion Strike decks have so much draw power as it is, and if we are using one of these setup-based attacks, we almost always would want to just accelerate an extra energy with our Mew V to make sure we have more attackers ready to go. So while it's nice that we are getting a couple more Fusion Strike cards in this set, this is not one that I think is particularly promising, so huge thumbs down from me. And speaking of Fusion Strike cards, we are getting a new Ice Cube in this set as well. It's a basic Pokemon with 110 HP, 1 retreat, and a Metal Weakness. And I think the first attack here is really the one we want to concentrate on. For a Water and Colorless, you choose one of your opponent's Pokemon, then this attack does 40 times the number of Fusion Energy attached to your Pokemon. Don't apply weakness or resistance for benched Pokemon. This fills kind of a similar role as Meloetta does. Instead of doing more upfront damage, we have a bit of a weaker damage modifier, but have the flexibility of attacking anything on the field. This is another attacker that we can use on turn 1 of the game with the Fusion Strike deck. We don't have to wait to evolve into Mew VMAX. And if we are going second and our opponent is leading the game with a Pokemon that is kind of worthless that we don't really care if we knock out, instead of going for the huge 200 plus damage play with Meloetta, we can instead maybe choose to go the Ice Cube route and maybe pick off something a little bit more important on the bench or soften up potentially their main attacker for our Mew VMAX to finish off on the following turn. So I think that's really the use that you would play Ice Cube for. You would more than likely cut into your Meloetta account, probably play one of each to give yourself different turn 1 options, but I struggle to see if this is good enough. The Fusion Strike deck already can hit really close to 300 damage as it is, so I think more often than not, if we do want to snipe the bench, I think we're probably better off just playing Oricorio. Being able to place 5 damage counters is almost always going to be enough to set up a KO for Mew VMAX or finish off an attacker that we maybe whiffed a one-shot on. The damage is not blocked by Manaphy. We have the flexibility of putting damage counters across multiple Pokemon. And also, if we don't choose to attack with it, Oricorio still serves a purpose by providing your Fusion Strike Pokemon some damage reduction. So unfortunately, I think Ice Cube winds up being a little bit outclassed here. Next up, we have another Pokemon V. That is going to be Raichu V. Basic Pokemon, fighting weakness, 1 retreat cost. Has 2 different attacks here. The first one for a lightning energy. We search our deck for a lightning energy and attach it to this Pokemon, then shuffle our deck. But if we go first, we can even use this attack on the first turn. And its other attack for 2 lightning energy, you discard any number of lightning energy from your Pokemon in play. Then this attack does 60 for each card you discarded in this way. So I think the easiest comparison to make for Raichu is going to be, this is kind of like a lightning version of Alchemy VMAX that we've seen in Shadow Rider decks, but in the form of a basic Pokemon. You know, we don't have quite as much HP as something like Alchemy, but this thing's a little bit easier to get in play and is actually a good Pokemon to lead the game with because of this first attack. So obviously the big partner we might look to for something like Raichu is going to be Flaffy variants, since Flaffy of course can accelerate lightning energy out of the discard pile. And Raichu in theory could make a decent sort of late game cleanup attacker. I don't think we're necessarily building around just Raichu though, because I think on average we'll probably have 2, sometimes 3 Flaffy in play. So with 2 Dynamotors from Flaffy plus an energy attachment per turn, I think we'll be sort of in the 180 to 240 range with this attack. That's not really getting a one-shot on too many things, and I think there's going to be better Pokemon we could play to kind of soften things up in that same manner. And Raichu could just be maybe a 1 of, maybe a 2 of in those styles of Flappy decks. But if you do want to go a little bit more all in with Raichu, we do still have cards like Raihan as well to cheat additional energies into play. And in theory, this could even be a partner for the new Arceus VSTAR, since the Trinity Nova attack will get a lot of damage on the board and accelerate some lightning energy in the process. process. Now, I actually really do like this Raichu card, but my reservation for it is really just in terms of how unproven Flaaffy variants have kind of been. We are getting the new Manaphy, which will help us a lot against decks like Rapid Strike Urshifu and Jolteon, but currently I'm kind of unsure what the incentive is to play a Flaaffy based deck over any of the others in the format. We have a ton of other more proven archetypes that aren't reliant on these stage 1s. So while I think Raichu V is really good in the context of Flaaffy variants, I'm still just not sure how I feel about Flaaffy decks as a whole. Next up from there, we have another Lightning Pokemon V, and that is going to be Raikou V, the final of the Legendary Beasts. And just as you would expect, this guy is almost identical to Suicune in Entei V. Same ability, same attack, but this case with lightning energy. Raikou does have a 1 retreat cost compared to the 2 and 3 retreat cost of its water and fire counterparts, but the trade-off, of course, is that it does have 200 HP instead. And I think a lot of my commentary for Raikou is going to be reminiscent of what we just discussed with Raichu V. Part of what makes Suicune so good is the fact that you can just play Melanie to accelerate energy and get powered up that way. And Entei can power itself up with a stadium card. Raikou, if you want to get powered up, is going to be reliant on a stage 1, and I think that's going to be generally a little bit clunkier than these other cards that you can just play down immediately. Now, I can see a world where we're playing some sort of Legendary Beast Toolbox basic attacker deck where we play things like Aurora Energy, plus maybe Melody on top of that to be able to cover our weaknesses against different decks. So that definitely seems like a deck idea that could be worth experimenting with. But on the flip side, if you guys are thinking of including Raikou in a more traditional Flaaffy based deck, I actually do like Raikou for those styles of decks. Only needing 2 energy is actually really nice because a lot of the other lightning energy based attackers are quite frankly energy hogs. And with Raikou, if you have 2 Flaaffy in play, you can get 2 energy on this guy. Plus you have your manual attachment for turn, and if Raikou does go down on your opponent's next turn, you still netted 1 additional energy on your field than had you not attacked with this thing. And that could be good if we're thinking about playing this maybe with Bolton VMAX, or of course the new Raichu V that we just looked at, or likewise Rayquaza VMAX. So again, much like in the case of Raichu, I think this is a potentially great inclusion for those Flaaffy based decks, but I think Flaaffy decks as a whole still need to prove themselves a little bit more before I fully commit to this card. Next up, we have a brand new Pachirisu card. This is going to be a basic Pokemon with 70 HP, 1 retreat fighting weakness, and 1 single attack. For a Lightning and Colorless Energy, this attack does 30 damage for each Pokemon tool attached to all of your Pokemon. So this is kind of a spiritual successor to the tool drop cards of the past like Trubbish and Doublade. Now this is a little bit worse because the tool drop attack did count your opponent's tool cards, whereas this is only the tools on your side of the field. But nevertheless, this is an interesting attack, especially because we are also getting the new Honchkrow V that will allow you to have up to 4 tool cards attached to it. So obviously the idea with this theoretical archetype is you want to have 2, maybe even 3 Honchkrow V in play and a mountain of Pokemon tool cards on your field to be able to one-shot anything in your path. Now, if you want to deal with a Pokemon VMAX, you are going to need roughly 11 Pokemon tool cards in play. So that is a good bit, but luckily Pachirisu can a little bit more easily deal with those 2-price Pokemon like regular Pokemon V and even new Pokemon VSTAR. And there's a ton of great tool cards you could potentially use with this thing. Choice Belt and EXP Share, I think, are going to be the absolute biggest ones in my mind for Pachirisu. Choice Belt obviously is going to fix your math, but then EXP Share could wind up being really important because unfortunately this thing has a 2 energy attack cost. And guys, honestly, that's kind of where I start to lose interest in this thing. Now, even though I do think this attack cost is a little bit clunky, we at least do have a little bit of flexibility in terms of how we want to power this up. Since it does have a colorless energy in the cost, that means we can maybe play cards like Capture Energy. But also one of the nice things about Pachirisu being lightning type is the fact that we have speed lightning energy that we can play alongside as well. But even beyond the clunky attack cost, I think the other big issue with this theoretical deck is just Honchkrow V. Obviously, the ability is fantastic for this deck, but it's still an ability on a multi-prize Pokemon, which means Path to the Peak can still shut it off and force you to discard some of those additional tools that you have on your Honchkrow. And then we still have other cards to contend with like Tool Scrapper, or our opponent can just boss up our Honchkrow and knock it out, gaining 2 prizes and taking 120 damage off of our field. So I'm definitely still going to experiment with Pachirisu. I think this card is a lot of fun, but I think had the attack cost of this been maybe just 2 colorless, or maybe had Honchkrow V been a single prize Pokemon, I think we would actually be in business. But unfortunately, I think this thing is literally just barely out of the realm of being a competitive single prize deck. Next up, we have Granbull V, and I'm going to do my best to make this kind of a short segment, but this is going to be a new Pokemon V, 210 HP, Metal Weakness, 2 Retreat Cost, and has 2 different attacks here. The first one for 2 Colorless Energy does 30, plus 10 more for each damage counter on this Pokemon. And then its other attack for 2 Psychic and a Colorless does 190, and this Pokemon does 30 damage to itself. Even though there is a little bit of obvious synergy between these 2 attacks, use the second attack to do 190, fueling your first attack to potentially be used on a future turn. But unfortunately, this second attack already is just not very good when we compare it to the other psychic options that we have in the format right now. And this first attack isn't that awful, but I think the issue is that it's printed on just a basic Pokemon V. Had this been maybe on a VMAX, maybe things would be a little bit different, but just having 210 HP means that we're probably never really going to be able to tank a hit with Granbull to be able to hit for a lot of damage with this thing. Now, if you are just absolutely steadfast and dedicated to playing this in a deck for some reason, we do still have a Gengar in the format that will allow you to move damage between your psychic Pokemon. So in theory, if you're playing some sort of VMAX, it can tank a hit. You can move 200 damage over to Granbull and hit for 230 damage that way, knocking out potentially any regular 2 prize Pokemon V. And even that is rarely ever going to happen if you were to try to play this theoretical deck that I'm outlining here. There's other basic 2 prize Pokemon that can hit for a similar amount of damage far easier than this thing, whether it's Zacian V, Suicune V, etc. Don't play Granbull. This card is god-awful. Next up, we have Dusknoir, and Dusknoir definitely has a history of getting cards with very interesting abilities, and this one I think does live up to that a little bit. It says, as often as you like during your turn, you may move a special energy from one of your Pokemon to another one of your Pokemon. Then it has a pretty unusable attack here for a Psychic and 2 Colorless does 120. But again, the ability is really the thing that would ever make us consider playing this. So if we just start thinking about Pokemon with special energy, what are the decks that come to mind? I know for me right now, it's mainly going to be the different battle style decks. Think Rapid Strike Urshifu, Single Strike decks, and Mew VMAX. But if that's the case, if we think about Rapid Strike Urshifu, well, we're discarding our energy most of the time. And there's already a Florges that does kind of the same thing for Rapid Strike Pokemon. So gotta cross that off our list. We think about Single Strike decks. Yet again, if we're playing something like Urshifu, we're discarding our energy. And just in general, Single Strike decks are based around being aggressive, trying to slow down and maybe use Dusknoir with something like Cheryl to heal off your Single Strike Pokemon does not really seem like a winning strategy. And even beyond that, we have things like Earn of Vitality, plus your Houndooms that are going to be in play anyway, so it's going to be easy to set up any Pokemon even after they lose their energies. Then in the case of Mew VMAX, well, if we have Dusknoir in play, that is going to limit the amount of cards we can draw with each of our Genesects in play. And while in theory, Dusknoir could allow you to attack with a Mew, copy Genesect's attack, free retreat into another Mew, and move that energy up to your active, well, just playing a copy of Switch accomplishes the same thing. So I think we're crossing all of those decks off the list. And the only ones I can really see are going to be colorless based decks like Togekiss VMAX or maybe even Blissey V that are playing things like Double Turbo Energy, powerful colorless energy, etc., etc. So I think we could pair this maybe with those decks with cards like Sharon's Care in the case of Blissey or Cheryl in the case of Togekiss VMAX to just try to tank and heal with our tanky colorless Pokemon. Now, I will say in the case of Togekiss VMAX, I actually don't completely hate the idea just because the big issue that Stage 2 decks normally face is that it's kind of hard to get them set up, but Togekiss can grab you Rare Candy plus your Dusknoir whenever you want to get set up. So you guys can tell, I think there might be some consideration to testing this out in these colorless decks, but it's definitely a hard case to be made here, especially since these colorless decks don't necessarily need Dusknoir to do a similar thing. So unfortunately, I probably will pass on this thing, but this still could be a card with some very long-term potential. I will at least say that. Alrighty guys, next up we have another Pokemon V-Star that is going to be Whimsicott V-Star. And Whimsicott V, while it's not too great, I will at least say its first attack is kind of okay for a Psychic Energy. We can do 20, and if the defending Pokemon is a basic, it can't attack during their next turn, so not great, but it can maybe be a way at buying a turn while you're trying to get set up. But Whimsicott V-Star, definitely the more interesting of the two Pokemon, 250 HP, a little bit weaker in terms of HP than some of the other V-Stars, but let's check out its attacks. The first one for a Psychic and 2 Colorless does 160, and your opponent can't play Pokemon tools or special energy from their hand during their next turn. And then its V-Star power is going to be an attack for a Psychic Energy, and it does 60 to one of your opponent's Pokemon for each energy attached to this Pokemon. So right out the gate, this first attack definitely catches my attention. This is basically just like the old Giratina EX, which saw a ton of play back when it was legal. Now, while some decks can kind of play around this to a degree with cards like Elisa Sparkle or even Houndoom for single strike decks, this is still going to be a thorn in the side of any of those special energy based decks, and at the very least could force them into some awkward plays and might make them occasionally whiff the big combo they need to get around this attack. But beyond those, of course, this just absolutely eviscerates Rapid Strike Urshifu. They have like literally no shot. That's like the freest matchup I can imagine for Whimsicott. But also we are getting Arceus VSTAR in this same set, which is a very hyped card, and I can definitely see a world where this can be an extremely oppressive attack to maybe prevent them from throwing down their double turbo energy and using Trinity Nova on their second turn. Being able to lock Pokemon tools also can be kind of nice. Of course, that is going to shut off things like Air Balloon, and a little bit more importantly after this set, the new Choice Belt. But of course, locking special energy is going to be the big thing here. And also, I do want to point out, if we are choosing to play this with Shadow Rider Calyrex, the base form Shadow Rider Calyrex V, its first attack for a Psychic Energy also will lock special energy. So even if you're going second, you can keep them locked of special energy every single turn of the game. And then I also do like this V-Star power as well. So if we have 6 energy on Whimsicott V-Star, that can deal with any Pokemon VMAX, and 4 to 5 energy plus Choice Belt also can deal with Pokemon V-Star. Like I said, I think Shadow Rider is going to be the main way people are thinking about playing this, but maybe you could play this even with Arceus V-Star as well. But overall, despite its low HP and certain popular decks can kind of play around this attack, I still like this, and I would not be surprised if it did see some play. Next up, we have one of the few Pokemon VMAX in this set, and that's going to be Mimikyu VMAX. So while there is no new Mimikyu V in Brilliant Stars, we do have to remember we have the other one from Battle Styles, I believe it was, that actually has a really good ability that prevents your opponent from attacking it. So we do need to keep that in mind. I think that does give a little bit of a boost to a card like this. But this guy, 300 HP, Dark Weakness, Fighting Resistance, 1 retreat cost, and 2 attacks. But the first one is really the big one here that I think might have you interested. You put 4 damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon in any way that you like, and if you played Acerolla's Premonition from your hand during this turn, put 13 damage counters instead. So that's actually some pretty decent spread damage, I'm not gonna lie. And one of the things that does make this attack a little bit more enticing too is the fact that Double Turbo Energy can be used on Mimikyu, and it actually does not change the effect of this attack, because we're replacing damage counters, not doing damage, so the damage reduction from that special energy will not apply to Mimikyu. But of course, this card is really, I think, only as good as Acerolla's Premonition, and that's a card I'm not sold on just yet, if I'm being honest, guys. Just for context, Acerolla's Premonition is a new supporter. You look at your opponent's hand, you draw a card for every trainer card that you find there. So it's kind of like the old Getsis, and even with that being said, Getsis still only saw play usually as like a one of for very select turns. Like you would never build your entire deck around Getsis, and that's kind of what you have to do here with Mimikyu VMAX. And I think that forces this card to fall into a trap where if your opponent sees that you're playing Mimikyu, they can just play down their hand to a lower hand size. They can play those trainer cards so that you can't draw a lot of cards, and when you're not drawing a lot of cards with Acerolla, you're probably not getting set up very well. Now, of course, you can play things like Shadow Rider Calyrex or maybe the new Bibarel to try to get around this a little bit, but it just feels bad to have to build your entire deck around a supporter card that very frequently is not going to be doing a whole lot. And with Ultra Ball coming out in the same set as well, that's only going to be another way your opponent can reduce their hand size even further. If you want to do this style of effect, just play Dragapult VMAX, guys. In the case of Dragapult, you actually put more damage counters on the field at a time. So for the moment, I am going to pass on Mimikyu VMAX. Next up, we have a brand new Alchemy card. This is going to be a Stage 1 Pokemon with 90 HP, Metal Weakness, and a 1 retreat cost. 90 HP, of course, guys, we need to keep that in mind because that does mean this entire evolution line is going to be level ball searchable. But Alchemy is a pretty cool card here. It has this ability: if this Pokemon is your active, your turn does not end when you play Cafe Master. And then this attack for 2 colorless energy, or of course just a twin energy or double turbo energy, you can do 10 plus 40 more for each type of basic energy attached to your Pokemon in play. For a little bit of context, we do have to go over what Cafe Master does. That's going to be a new supporter card that usually does end your turn after you play it, but you search your deck for 3 different types of basic energy and attach each of them to a different benched Pokemon. So you guys can see what they are attempting to push with this whole archetype. Flood a ton of energy in play with Cafe Master, hit for a mountain of damage with Alchemy. So if we just run through the math, if we have 8 different types of energy in play, that's going to be 330 damage, which is honestly a really solid number to hit for. That does require you to have every single different type of energy in play, but there definitely are a few other cards that can help Alchemy out when pulling off this strategy. Of course, we have EXP Share to attempt to preserve all of these different energies that we have in play. And actually, this card was revealed months ago, way before we saw the cards that were in Starbirth. And now that we've seen that we are getting the new by Burrell in this Brilliant Stars set, I think that also gives this deck a boost because we basically want to play Cafe Master almost every turn. But usually the downside with that is that we can't play cards like Research or Marnie to draw a bunch of cards and get set up. But thanks to by Burrell, we can actually play Cafe Master and still be able to refill our hand and see more cards in a given turn. But as you can tell by my rating, I am not so convinced of Alchemy just yet, unfortunately. I think kind of on paper, you want to play Twin Energy or Double Turbo Energy, but the issue with that, of course, is that it eats into your basic energy count that you need for this deck to do damage. And I think the other sort of inherent flaw that this archetype has is that Alchemy has to be your active to not end your turn when you play Cafe Master, but Cafe Master accelerates to your bench. So you basically always have to have 2 alchemies set up at any given point, one with an air balloon to freely retreat and a different one on the bench that you want to power up. But then once you start doing that, you run into issues where you can't play an EXP share on your next alchemy that you have lined up. So you might have to play weird things like the shopping mall stadium to rearrange your tool cards a bit. And we're just starting to get kind of into really clunky territory here, guys. And even though I really like a lot of the tools that this deck has at its disposal and the way a lot of these cards synergize, I think it definitely has some pretty big issues that might hold it back from ever being competitive. Next up, we have the first of 2 different Flygons we're getting in this set. This one's going to be a new Stage 2 Pokemon, 150 HP, Grass Weakness, 1 retreat cost, and even though it has 2 attacks, the first one's the one we really want to focus on. For just 1 fighting energy, does 50 for each energy in your opponent's active Pokemon's retreat cost. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because we actually have quite a few different Pokemon in the format that have an attack kind of similar to this. Of course, the most notable one is going to be Leafeon VMAX. And there's definitely some trade-offs between both of these Pokemon. Of course, Leafeon has a multi-energy attack cost and gives up 3 prize cards. But on the flip side, Flygon has a much more manageable attack cost, but as a result, it does do a little bit less damage. And being a stage 2 makes this probably a little bit more difficult to get up and running as well. Now, even though Flygon can, of course, hit the brand new Arceus VSTAR for weakness, I'm not sold on this damage modifier for other matchups out there. So, of course, if our opponent has a 2 retreat cost by default, which is one of the more popular retreat costs we see in a lot of decks, that's going to make this thing hit for 100 damage. But of course, if we have a Galar Mine in play, we're going to be able to hit for 200 instead. But unfortunately, 200 is quite a bit shy of where we want to be. With the Choice Belt, we can bump this up to 230 to make quick work of some of the basic Pokemon V in the format. But realistically, I think we want to be hitting for 250 bare minimum because we want to at least be able to knock out V-Star Pokemon in one hit. So unless we see the format trend very heavily in favor of basic Pokemon V attackers, such as Zacian, Suicune, etc., I don't think Flygon's going to be as well positioned as I would like it to be. So I think Flygon is a fair, serviceable card, but unfortunately that's not enough to actually make this competitive, so I am going to have to pass on it, unfortunately. Next up, we have a brand new Lucario. This is going to be a Stage 1 Pokemon with 120 HP, Psychic Weakness, 2 retreat cost, and is, in a way, kind of a spiritual successor to a card back from the Sun and Moon era. So let's see if you can guess which one it is. This ability says, once during your turn, you may put 2 damage counters on this Pokemon. If you do, search your deck for a fighting energy and attach it to this Pokemon, then shuffle your deck. And this attack for 2 fighting energy does 10, and you discard all fighting from this Pokemon, and it does 60 more for each energy card discarded in this way. So yes, this is kind of a spiritual successor to the Charizard back from Team Up. Actually, one of my personal favorite single prize Stage 2s we had back in the Sun Moon era. And while on paper that makes Lucario seem really appealing since it is just a Stage 1, I do think this card overall is a bit weaker than the Charizard was. So the big thing with Charizard is that you got multiple energies with its ability, and you had access to cards like Welder on top of that. Lucario does have some energy acceleration options, but I don't think most of them are too great right now. I think one of the more aggressive ones we have in the format right now is going to be B, where we have a chance to hit some extra energy off the top 5 cards of our deck. We also have the Galarian Zapdos that allows you to attach 2 fighting energy whenever you bench it from hand. So you could in theory play things like that in Energy Switch, or maybe a little bit more reliably in terms of our energy acceleration options, we have Raihan still in the format. So if you do have your big wombo combo of your ability, your attachment for turn, plus Raihan, you can hit for 190 with this card. But guys, I have to say, I think that's going to be a lot to ask for. You're going to need a new Stage 1 and basic Pokemon every turn. You have to run a high count of a supporter card that you don't want to draw early on in the game. And even once you jump through all these hoops, you're very rarely going to ever be able to one-shot something like a Pokemon VSTAR or Pokemon VMAX. And on top of all this too, if Mew VMAX looks to still be one of the most popular decks after Brilliant Stars drops, I think a deck like that can make quick work of a card like Lucario. Mew is not only going to resist your damage, but also since you can never one-shot Mew VMAX, it can actually loop its 70 damage attack with Mew V to knock you out and heal off damage in the process. And if we're going for the two-shot war as a single prize deck, I think we have more reliable ways at being able to pull that off. Up next, we have a brand new Muck. This can be a Stage 1 Pokemon, Fighting Weakness, and a 3 retreat cost. But we're looking at this thing mainly for this ability. If your opponent's active is poisoned, its retreat cost is 1 more energy. And it does have an attack of its own for a Dark, and 2 colorless is 90, and your opponent's active is now poisoned and confused. So you can kind of see the synergy they're attempting to push with this card. That being said though, I don't think we should probably be attacking with Muck. This attack is not that strong. You're effectively doing 100 for 3 once you factor in the poison. I think more than likely, if you did want to play Muck, this would likely be a potential partner for some of the different cards we have in the format that do more damage for the energy in your opponent's retreat cost. Most notably, Leafeon VMAX, that's definitely going to be the most likely candidate. So in theory, if you have a Galar Mine in play, plus 1 to 2 Muck, you do have the potential to one-shot a lot of stuff. But of course, the big issue is you do have to find a way to poison your opponent's active too. And now we're really getting into some clunky territory. I think one of the better options we do have if you wanted to attempt this is going to be some card like Galarian Slowbro V, or Weepinbell, or Butterfree. But now you're playing a Stage 1, another Pokemon line to poison your opponent, and then you still have to play your attacker, never mind any consistency Pokemon you want. Maybe we can revisit this, but for the moment, as long as Galar Mine exists, I'm really not a big fan of this Muck. Next up, we have Honchkrow V, one of the most interesting Pokemon I think we're getting in Brilliant Stars. This is going to be a new basic Pokemon with this ability that says this Pokemon can have up to 4 Pokemon tools attached to it. If this ability stops working, discard tools from this Pokemon until there is only 1 tool attached. And it does have an attack of its own we will briefly highlight for 2 Dark Energy and a Colorist is 130. And your opponent reveals their hand. So obviously the big card that we are thinking about pairing this with is going to be the new Pachirisu, but even though we're getting that new card, we also do have to remember we have the Whimsicott back from Vivid Voltage as well, which is another card that really does pair nicely with this. And actually out of the 2 single prize Pokemon that you can pair with Honchkrow, I think I actually might be leaning a little bit more towards Whimsicott. So Whimsicott does 10 plus 40 for each of your Pokemon tools in play that you choose to discard. So even though you discard your Pokemon tools, that damage multiplier is a little bit better than that of Pachirisu, and it's a little bit easier to take big one-hit knockouts. Now, of course, the big downside to this ability, though, is the fact that this is extremely susceptible to cards like Path to the Peak. Because if you do have 4 tool cards sitting on this Honchkrow and your opponent throws down a path, well, suddenly you have to discard a ton of tools, and that actually might make a difference in terms of being knocked out as well. I think one of the big cards you could look to pair with this is Cape of Toughness to make sure your Honchkrow can survive a hit. So in theory, if you have 4 Cape of Toughness, you can give this thing 400 HP, which is absolutely insane. But there's actually a variety of other tools in the format that could be very annoying for your opponent to deal with if you have them in multiple counts on your Honchkrow. Some of the other ones are going to be cards like Spirit Mask and Rugged Helmet for some extra disruption. And in theory, you could even play maybe some sort of Arceus variant or Dark deck where you attack with Honchkrow and use 4 Choice Belts to do an extra plus 120 to your opponent. So while I definitely think there are some issues with Honchkrow, I'm still going to land a little bit more in the middle on this card. I think this card has a ton of potential. I'm looking forward to seeing if someone in the community can figure out how to break this card. Up next, we have a brand new Liepard. This is going to be a Stage 1 with a very familiar looking ability. And it's Trade. You may discard a card from your hand, and once during your turn, you may draw 2 cards. So this is the same ability back from Zoroark GX. And in terms of more recent memory, the Cinccino back from Sword and Shield. Now, unfortunately, I do think the big downside to Liepard compared to Cinccino is the fact that this has 100 HP rather than 90, because that means Liepard is not going to be level ball searchable. This attack also a little bit worse than Cinccino's as well. Cinccino can get in some chip damage just for a single attachment, yet Liepard is going to need you to commit 2 energies. Yeah, I think that's a much tougher sell. That being said though, this ability is very, very good, and after Cinccino rotates, Liepard is definitely going to be poised to take its spot in the game. But even while Cinccino is still legal, there are still some select instances where Liepard could be preferable. I think one of the most obvious examples is going to be with Eternatus VMAX. So of course, Eternatus VMAX is going to do more damage for each bench sitter that you have in play. And what better way to power up your attacks than with a Pokemon that can draw you some cards in the process? Liepard is not susceptible to Path to the Peak. You obviously couldn't play Cinccino in Eternatus due to its typing, so being able to now play this single prize draw engine that isn't susceptible to Path to the Peak actually could be a pretty big selling point for this card while it's waiting for Cinccino to rotate. But that being said, I think most decks, largely speaking, are going to prefer Cinccino, and as a result, I'm going to land a little bit more neutrally on this card. Liepard's definitely very good, but unfortunately its normal type counterpart is going to outshine it temporarily until it rotates over the summer. Next up, we have a new Darkmoor Pechovie. This thing has 190 HP, Grass Weakness, and a 1 retreat cost. Its first attack for 2 colorless energy does 30, and you may switch this Pokemon with one of your benched Pokemon. And its second attack for 2 dark and a colorless is 120, and if you played Marnie's Pride from your hand during your turn, this attack does 120 more damage. So a couple of interesting things going on with this card. Of course, it has this hit and run attack. 2 energy does make powering this up a little bit clunky. Like, of course, we could use the new double turbo energy, but we're already only doing 30 damage, and taking a 20 damage reduction seems just out of the question if I'm being honest. So you are going to have to run some copies of Galarian Moltres V and or the new Marnie's Pride or Raihan if you want to be able to reliably power up this thing. And speaking of Marnie's Pride, just for context, it's a new supporter card that allows you to accelerate a basic energy from your discard to one of your benched Pokemon. Overall, fairly weak supporter. I think most of the time this is going to be worse than Raihan, but unfortunately we are kind of stuck playing it if we do want to be able to make use of this second attack. And I think we do, because 240 is a half decent number to hit for. That's going to deal with most basic Pokemon V, and with a choice belt, that's going to one-shot every V-Star outside of Arceus. Because we have other cards that can do roughly the same amount of damage much easier. Definitely a big thumbs down, but I do love the art on this thing. I do think it's kind of neat. Both this one and the Lightning one have like a hit and run style of attack, but unfortunately it's just not strong enough to actually see play. So next up, we have the final VMAX of the set review. That's going to be the brand new Aggron VMAX here. And briefly, we do need to actually point out Aggron V. I do think it is kind of an interesting card here. For a metal and 2 colorless is 90, and then 30 to 2 of your opponent's benched Pokemon. And then its second attack for a massive metal and 4 colorless does 150, plus 150 more if your opponent's active has any damage counters on it. And then if we look ahead to Aggron V Max, this thing is 330 HP, Fire Weakness, Grass Resistance, and a massive 4 retreat cost, just like its pre-evolution. Its first attack for a metal and 2 colorless does 150, and you mill the top card of your opponent's deck. And its second attack, yet again clocking in at a massive 5 energy cost, this time for a 2 metal and 3 colorless, does 270, and this Pokemon does 30 to itself. So I'm not gonna lie, I actually think Aggron V might debatably be the more interesting out of these 2 cards that we're looking at here. And that's really because this second attack can actually creep up high enough to one-shot opposing Pokemon V Max. Now, of course, guys, you already know the big issue with this card is this unfortunate attack cost. Metal still has Metal Saucer for the moment. There's cards like Turbo Patch, and we are getting, of course, the new Double Turbo Energy in this set as well that will kind of help with that attack cost a little bit. But the Double Turbo Energy is actually kind of an annoyance. Even though they do provide 2 colorless energy, it will actually reduce your damage by 20, and that 20 reduction is actually pretty significant, because that in many cases is going to change a 1-shot to a 2-shot, or at the very least force you to snipe multiple times with Inteleon if you do want to pick off a Pokemon V Max. You actually do comfortably one-shot Pokemon VSTAR, but I think there is actually easier ways at doing so than with Aggron here. But ultimately, even though I think this second attack on Aggron V is really the only interesting one here, chaining a 5 energy attack turn after turn on a Pokemon with only 230 HP is going to be an issue that I'm not so confident Aggron V and VMAX will be able to overcome. Now, of course, you could elect to play something like Memory Capsule to buff your HP in these instances, but at that point, you're forgoing access to Choice Belt. And that's going to be one of the main ways you can actually take those one-shots that you so desire to. So unfortunately, I think I am going to have to pass on Aggron here. Next up, we have a Scavalier, and this is a really cool Pokemon. Even though this attack isn't that great, this ability is actually really cool. It says this Pokemon takes 100 less damage from the attacks of your opponent's Pokemon V after applying weakness and resistance. Pokemon V are everywhere, and being able to reduce their damage by 100 is definitely solid, but don't get too excited just because, of course, the base HP on a Scavalier is only 120, so effectively your opponent has to do 220 or more to knock you out, and, you know, most decks unfortunately are able to do that right now. Even with something like Big Charm, I don't think against a lot of decks that's really going to change a 1-shot to a 2-shot. And then if you are the Escavalier player, you have to remember, you still have to take prizes and win. And unfortunately, this attack is not too strong. Just doing 90 and a 30 snipe is nowhere near enough. I think if hypothetically you were to try to play this card, you would need to play, of course, Choice Belt to buff your damage, and probably also the Galarian Berserker. So if you have 2 Galarian Berserkers in play plus Choice Belt, suddenly you're actually hitting for enough to 2-shot Pokemon VMAX. And I think this is just a really convoluted way of having to do that. There's other cards, both single and multi-prize, that can 2-shot VMAXs with much less of a headache than this card is going to give you. So don't fall for this ability. It's a complete trap, but it's a very neat card if nothing else. Next up, we have a new Zamazenta V. This is not a reprint of the old one from Sword and Shield, but it's a basic Pokemon with 220 HP, Fire Weakness, Grass Resistance, and a 2 retreat cost. And it has an ability. It says you can use this once during your turn. If you do, your turn ends, but you discard your hand and draw 5. And then its only attack here for a metal and 2 colorless is 120 plus 30 more for each prize card your opponent has already taken. You know, this ability definitely reminds me a little bit of Zacian V, how some decks wouldn't even play metal energy. They would literally just play Zacian to be able to use Intrepid Sword to set up for the first couple turns. I could see a world where something like that happens with Zamazenta, especially maybe in decks that want certain cards in the discard pile. Think of stuff like Mad Party, the new Wormadoms, Fire decks, etc. And this attack actually does have some decent one-shot potential against a lot of Pokemon running around. If your opponent has taken 5 prize cards, you're going to be hitting for 270 damage, and that's before you factor in Choice Belt as well. Even though this is going to be a little bit shy of a potential late game one-shot against a Pokemon VMAX, this is going to be able to deal with pretty much any of the Pokemon VSTAR, with Arceus being one of the only kind of annoying situations. But even if your opponent has just taken 3 prize cards, that's going to be enough to knock out a lot of 2 prize Pokemon. So I do like this Zamazenta V. I think my knee-jerk reaction would be to potentially play this as a one-of in some sort of Zacian deck, because in the late game, this thing actually does hit harder than Zacian and has a little bit of flexibility in terms of how you want to power it up. Zacian V, of course, can only use metal energies, whereas Zamazenta could theoretically be powered up with other stuff like Capture Energy or even double turbo energy if you did decide to go that route. I think if we ever see some sort of Aurora energy-based toolbox, especially now that we have a lot of good basic attackers, like all of the legendary beasts as an example, this could be a decent metal attacker for toolbox decks like that. As you can see, I've landed on a more neutral rating for Zamazenta, but I'm definitely much closer leaning to the positive side than the negative side of this card. Next up, we have a Dragon-type Flygon V coming out in this set. It's a basic Pokemon, 220 HP, no weakness or resistance per usual for Dragon Pokemon, and a 2 retreat cost. Its first attack, very underwhelming for a Grass and Fighting, does 70, but more interestingly, its second attack for a Grass, 2 Fighting, and a Colorless is 160, and if your opponent's active is a VMAX, this does 160 more damage, and discard 3 energy from this Pokemon. Like, first of all, this thing is a Dragon type, hits nothing in the game for weakness, it has this absurd energy cost, and after you finish moving mountains in heaven and earth to be able to power this thing up, they're going to force you to discard all of that energy again. So this is definitely a hard sell, but there are some good attributes to this card. 320 is actually a great number to hit for it. That's going to one-shot a lot of Pokemon VMAX, and with just one Choice Belt, that's going to be enough to deal with all of the other ones that are outside that 320 range. So let's not get it misconstrued. Flygon does hit like a truck. But of course, I think the biggest obstacle to this card is going to be this attack cost. This is really going to be tough to overcome. Now, of course, in the case of grass Pokemon, we have Rillaboom still in the format. There is a world where you could go Voltage Beat with Rillaboom to attach 2 grass energies from deck, use Raihan to accelerate a fighting energy from discard, and then manually attach a fighting energy for turn to finish powering up this wild 4 energy attack in a single turn. But worst case scenario, we can always play this with Arceus VSTAR as well. Arceus VSTAR, of course, will allow us to accelerate any 3 basic energies to our Pokemon V. Doesn't specify what type, so we can mix and match to power up our Flygons. And even though I think out of these deck ideas, the Arceus one is probably the more feasible one we could see, I think there's much easier ways at dealing with opposing Pokemon VMAX. Arceus can already accelerate energy to whatever it wants, and if you want to counter a certain VMAX, I'd almost just rather play a different basic Pokemon that can hit whatever you're trying to counter for weakness. So if you're trying to deal with something like Rapid Strike Urshifu, just play a copy of Hoopa V. Want to deal with Ice Rider Calyrex? Play something like Zacian or the new Zamazenta. I think the toolbox of attackers that Arceus has to pull from are just generally going to be easier to get up and running than chaining these Flygons. So unfortunately, it is going to be a pass for me. I think this energy cost is just slightly too steep to make it worthwhile. Next up, guys, we have a brand new Garchomp. I gotta say, I think this card is really, really cool. It's a stage 2 Pokemon with 160 HP, 1 retreat cost, but most importantly, it has this ability whenever you play this Pokemon from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon during your turn, you may prevent all damage and effects of attacks done to this Pokemon during your opponent's next turn. And then its attack for a Water and Fighting does 160, and you discard the top 2 cards of your deck. So first, let's address the good of this card. Obviously, this ability is absolutely fantastic. Being able to effectively force your opponent into two-shotting a single prizer is absolutely massive. You already have some degree of a prize advantage just being a single prize deck, and then on top of that, taking that one prize away from your opponent each time you evolve into a Garchomp is really, really sick. Now, of course, there are some holes in this strategy. Your opponent can always play something like a Boss's Orders to pick off something on your bench, or play something like an Escape Rope, but you have to imagine throughout the course of a game, this walling strategy is probably going to work at least 2 times. And sometimes that is going to be enough to swing the prize trade back in your favor. But I definitely have some conflicting feelings about this attack. 160, honestly not an awful number to hit for. You can two-shot really any Pokemon VMAX, especially once we factor in Choice Belt into the mix. But we are going to be short of a one-shot on a lot of basic Pokemon V out there. Think of things like Suicune, Zacian, etc. Discarding the top 2 cards of your deck is also no bueno for a Stage 2 deck. You have so many moving pieces in your deck and very few luxury cards that you really don't mind discarding. And as a result, you probably are going to hemorrhage a couple of important cards from time to time with this thing. And that's going to force you to carve out space for additional copies of things like Ordinary Rod, which you already probably don't have space for if you are a Stage 2 deck. Of course, the 2 energy cost also kind of annoying, but we do of course have Raihan to be able to power this thing up. And if your opponent can't attack into your Garchomp, that gives you extra turns to be able to get down more manual attachments as well. So I think the energy cost, while kind of annoying, is kind of manageable, but my biggest issues with this attack are going to be the discarding effect and the damage output. So I think you're absolutely going to need to play probably something like Inteleon or possibly the new Burrell to be able to find Raihan on those specific turns that you need them. And if you do choose to go the Inteleon route, that theoretically could fix your math for some of these basic Pokemon V decks that I did mention Garchomp could struggle against. So this card is definitely a question mark for me. I'm very interested at testing this archetype out, but this is a Stage 2 at the end of the day, and it might require more resources than this deck is going to be able to have access to in a 60 card list. But we'll have to see. I'm going to remain cautiously optimistic and land in the middle on this thing. Next up, we have an absolutely terrible Pokemon V, and that is going to be Dracovish V. I actually thought this card was originally coming out in Fusion Strike, and I did review it in that set review. So if you watch that, you will know my commentary for this is not going to be positive. This thing is a basic Pokemon with 220 HP, 3 retreat cost, and 2 attacks, both of which have really stupid attack cost. First one, for a Grass in Water. Before doing damage, you discard all Pokemon tools attached to your opponent's active. If you did discard a Pokemon tool in this way, this attack does 120 more. And the second attack for a Grass in 2 Water does 210, and you can't use this attack on your next turn. But in Dracovish's defense, I actually think this card is slightly better releasing in Brilliant Stars than had it released in Fusion Strike, just because almost every deck you're playing against is almost guaranteed to have a Choice Belt attached, and doing 180 for 2, even though it's a Grass and a Water, is definitely a little bit more feasible than it would have been several months ago. And to be fair, there are some ways at getting this thing powered up. Of course, the most notable one is going to be with Melanie. That will allow you to cheat 1 extra water energy into play per turn. But if you do want to be able to more reliably pull off this second attack, you can choose to play this thing with something like Arceus VSTAR, or also the Frostlass that accelerates water energy out of the discard pile. That being said though, you guys have probably heard my spiel when it comes to reviewing these sorts of basic Pokemon V that hit for around 200. Why would I play this over Zacian V? That's the question you always have to ask yourself. This thing hits for less damage than Zacian V, has a worse attack cost, doesn't have a great ability that powers itself up, and hits nothing for weakness. So yeah, big thumbs down. Dracovish is straight garbage. Next up, we have a new Farfetch'd card. This is going to be a very straightforward one. It's a basic Pokemon with 80 HP, has 1 attack here for 2 colorless, does 20, plus 10 more for each damage counter on your opponent's active Pokemon. So if this looks familiar, it probably should. It's very similar to a couple of other cards we've had in recent memory. Of course, the most recent one's going to be the Rapid Strike Basculin, but also this is very similar to a Zangoose that isn't too old either. And Farfetch, in theory, could be a decent way at cleaning up KOs while keeping your multi-prize Pokemon out of harm's way. So let's say you are playing a deck that is largely focused on 2-hit knockouts. Let's just say Arceus VSTAR for the sake of example. You can do 180 with your Arceus, then the next turn, throw down a twin or more likely double turbo energy, use Farfetch, come in, get the KO, and now you're forcing your opponent theoretically into a 7-prize game. And really any 2-hit oriented deck that can accelerate energy into play, I think has to at least consider Farfetch'd, since more often than not, this attack is going to be strong enough to clean up those KOs. Next up, we have one of my absolute most favorite new cards we are getting in the new Brilliant Star set. That's going to be everyone's favorite HM Slave by Burrell. This is going to be a new Stage 1 Pokemon, 120 HP, Fighting Weakness, 2 retreat cost, and it has this ability, once during your turn, you may draw until you have 5 cards in your hand, and then it has a pretty irrelevant attack, 100 on a coin flip. So yeah, we never want to use this attack, but this ability, absolutely incredible. This is effectively a reprint of the old Octillery, all the way back from Breakthrough, which was one of the most played support Pokemon throughout its lifespan. This ability is so flexible and could really be seen in a ton of different decks out there. I think single prize decks, even stage 2 decks, definitely could make use of a card like this. Most of the best support Pokemon up until recently have either been multi-prize support Pokemon or the Inteleon line, which, while good, takes up a ton of deck space and isn't as easy to fit in as a simple stage 1 like this that you can reuse every single turn of the game. And also the other thing I love about this is that it opens you up to playing other search-based and non-draw-based supporters in your deck. Because usually one of the big issues with non-draw-based supporters is the fact that they usually don't let you see enough cards per turn to help keep your deck setting up. We also have Ultra Ball coming back into the format, which is great for every deck, but being able to discard 2 cards from your hand is great for a card like Bibarel, as that will allow you to draw more cards back up to 5. And also, unlike cards like Crobat V or Genesect V, this doesn't get shut off by Path to the Peak. I've already been experimenting with it in a couple of different decks so far. The only thing I wish was different is that I wish this card had 90 HP. But other than that, this is still a fantastic new support Pokemon, and I would certainly bet on this thing seeing play. Alrighty, next up, we are getting to the big bad mascot of the set. That is, of course, the Pokemon god himself, Arceus VSTAR. But unlike a lot of evolving Pokemon V, the base form Arceus V, very good as well. It has 220 HP, fighting weakness, 2 retreat cost, and this first attack that is very good for 2 energy, or just a double turbo energy. You search your deck for up to 3 basic energy cards and attach them to your Pokemon V in any way that you like. So even if you are going second on your first turn, you can still find a way at cheating some energy into play. But Arceus VSTAR is of course going to be the main attraction here. The VSTAR is going to get bumped all the way up to 280 HP, making this the tankiest of all the VSTARs right now. And it has this one attack very similar to its pre-evolution for 3 colorless energy now. Trinity Nova does 200 damage, and then you search your deck for up to 3 basic energy cards and attach them to your Pokemon V in any way that you like. And then for its VSTAR power, it has the Starbirth ability. During your turn, you may search your deck for up to 2 cards and put them into your hand, then shuffle your deck. I think we're going to see a lot of really creative experimentation with Trinity Nova. I've already seen talks of playing this with Dark Pokemon, Metal Pokemon, Charizard V-Star, Solo Arceus with Inteleon, Water variants with Melanie. You can play this with really almost anything, it feels like. Think of other Pokemon V and VMAX that do more damage for every energy you have in play as well. So decks like Shadow Rider, Calyrex, Bolton VMAX, etc. could definitely make use of this, even though they have some energy acceleration currently. And then talking about this ability, this thing is absolutely insane. Basically, whenever you evolve into this, if you can't find the combo pieces that you need to get off your Trinity Nova, this ability is almost certain to guarantee you the remaining pieces that you need to get off your attack. But if you're fortunate enough to not need this ability to get set up, this is a fantastic ability to just save and pop at the end of the game whenever you need that last boss's orders to clean up a knockout. Or even in the mid game, this is a great ability to find very turn-specific cards, things like Melanie or Raihan, or this could even find you like powerful one-of item cards like Tool Scrapper as an example. Choice Belt allows this thing to one-shot Pokemon V, and if you are afraid of fighting Pokemon like the various Urshifu cards, we also have a Dunsparce still that can eliminate that fighting weakness. I'd say by far this is the most hyped new attacker we're getting in Brilliant Stars, and for very good reason. Big thumbs up for Arceus VSTAR. Definitely let me know down below in the comment section too, what way do you want to play this new card? Next up, we have a new Tornadus card. It's going to be a basic with a pretty decent coming into play ability. It says whenever you play this Pokemon from your hand onto your bench, you may have your opponent switch their active with one of their benched Pokemon, but of course your opponent chooses the new active. So this is kind of like a one-sided escape rope that you can search out with cards like Quick Ball and Ultra Ball. But also since this is a non-rulebox Pokemon, we can even abuse this with Scoop Up Net to be able to pick this up and reuse this ability throughout the course of a game. And there definitely is a world where this could see some play. Back before it rotated, the Fion card back from Cosmic Eclipse was a very highly played card, and there was also a Hawlucha back during the XY era that had this same ability that did see some minor play in Mega Gardevoir decks. In decks like Dragapult, Jolteon, etc., they're trying to snipe in very specific places. Definitely could consider Tornadus if they are already playing cards like Scoop Up Net in their deck. And then if you do want to get a little bit more gimmicky with Tornadus as well, we do still have the Serena V in standard format that can discard Pokemon from its bench to do more damage. So in that case, you could bench Tornadus, discard it from play, eventually get it back with cards like Ordinary Rod, and be able to still reuse this ability on a different turn. That being said, Escape Rope is still a card in the format, and a lot of the decks that are playing Scoop Up Net, currently at least, are playing the Inteleon engine, and Inteleon can already find you cards like Escape Rope or Boss's Orders to manipulate your opponent's active Pokemon. So I think it's a little bit questionable, this card's future. The precedent is definitely set for this card to see play, so I think it's a card that's worth owning, but I'm really just not sure what its best application is just yet. Next up, we have Drampa V, but I really don't want to spend too much time on this card. I'm basically only covering it because it's a V Pokemon in this set. But it's a 210 HP basic, weak to fighting, to retreat, has 2 attacks. The first one for a colorist is 20 and you draw 2. So kind of like the attack that we've seen on the Tapu Koko V. And its other attack for 3 colorist is 160 and you discard the top 2 cards of your deck. So while in theory 160 is a decent 2-shotting number, and we can play things like Melanie and Double Turbo Energy to be able to power this up in a single turn, there are just other better Pokemon V that can hit for a similar amount of damage much easier. Being a colorless Pokemon also does you no favors because you hit absolutely nothing for weakness. And if you do want to play a strong colorless Pokemon, well, guess what? We just looked at a very good one a couple cards ago in the form of Arceus VSTAR. But even beyond that, we still have much better colorless Pokemon in the game right now, like Blissey V, and even old cards like Togekiss VMAX after this set releases does look to get a bit of a boost. I just don't see the reason to play this when there's so many other better colorless Pokemon and just in general better Pokemon V. Terrible card, please do not play this thing. Next up, we have Acerola's Premonition, a card we did mention a little bit when talking about Mimikyu VMAX, but it's a new supporter that says your opponent reveals their hand and draw a card for each trainer card you find there. This card actually reminds me a lot of the old supporter card back from the Plasma sets called Getsis. Getsis had a very similar effect. Your opponent revealed their hand and you drew a card for each item you found there. Slightly more restrictive in that regard, but you forced your opponent to shuffle all of those cards back into their deck after you played it. But even being a card that good, it was really only ever a one of in certain decks. Acerola's Premonition, I think on average is going to get you a few more cards every time you play it. I think more than likely you're drawing maybe 3, maybe 4 with this thing. But if that's the case, guys, we have much more reliable ways at being able to do that. I mean, we have Hop, straight draw 3. Like, yeah, you don't get knowledge of your opponent's hand, but they can't play around the effect. And there's never going to be a turn when you play it and get nothing. And that is something that definitely could happen with Acerola's Premonition. But unless a card like Vikavolt V gains traction that can lock your opponent's item cards, I think this card's going to be pretty weak and probably isn't going to see a whole lot of play. Next up, we have Blunder Policy. This is a new Pokemon tool card that we've been a little bit overdue to get, but it says if you flip any coins for an attack of the Pokemon this card is attached to and get tails, draw 3 cards at the end of your turn. So this is kind of a neat effect. It's basically saying, hey, we know coin flip cards normally aren't that good, but some of them have some cool attacks, and if you are feeling saucy enough to play them, we're at least going to give you a couple of extra cards if you do wind up flipping tails. But in terms of it being a competitive card, I don't really see much incentive to play this. Normally, if you're flipping coins for an attack, you're trying to do more damage. And while drawing 3 is nice, it doesn't really fix the issue that flipping tails is causing you. Whereas a card like Glimwood Tangle at least gives you a chance to remedy the issue of the coin flip attack to begin with. So overall, I think this card is pretty weak, but it's a fun card if nothing else. Next up, we have Cafe Master. This is going to be a new supporter card that says choose up to 3 of your bench Pokemon. For each of those Pokemon, search your deck for a different basic energy card and attach it to that Pokemon, then shuffle your deck, but your turn ends. Being able to search your deck for 3 different energy cards is pretty solid, but every basic energy needing to be different might be one of the big downsides to this. I'm actually not really even bothered by the turn ending, because I think more than likely if we were to play this outside of the Alchemy deck, more than likely this would be a one of in your deck that you would attempt to search out on turn 1 with Lumineon V to get your board set up a little bit. But we just have to ask what deck wants to play 3 different types of basic energy. I guess Arceus variants could, but then I would argue Arceus V can already provide a similar effect if you're going second. At that point, this would basically just be better served as another copy of Double Turbo Energy. And I guess you could run this in Dragon decks, but again, what Dragon deck are we playing that we're not just going to play with Arceus? So as you guys can tell, I'm just kind of struggling where we would want to play this. I think pulling off this effect really isn't going to be that hard if it's our second turn going first, because again, we can just search this out immediately with our Lumineon V. But that's about where my enthusiasm is going to end for this thing. Next up, we have Charon's Care. This is going to be a supporter that says put one of your colorless Pokemon that has any damage counters on it and all cards attached to it into your hand. So players who played back during the Sun and Moon era will definitely recognize this effect. This is essentially just Acerola, but exclusively for colorless Pokemon. And even though that is quite restrictive compared to Acerola, I don't think that makes this card unplayable. We definitely have a few cards that would like to abuse Charon's Care. Of course, we are getting the new Arceus VSTAR, so I definitely can see a line of play where you use Trinity Nova to power up your field, Your opponent attacks into you, they probably don't knock you out since you have 280 HP, then you pop Starbirth, search your deck for Charon's Care, pick your Arceus out of harm's way, and keep on attacking. Definitely could see that happening, but even beyond that, we have other things in the format like Togekiss VMAX, and Togekiss VMAX in particular definitely could look to be a tanking archetype that could pop up after Brilliant Stars. It's getting double turbo energy to attack with a single attachment, and Togekiss can search Charon out of your deck for you with its attack. So that definitely seems like a deck idea that could be worth trying out after this set releases. And basically any colorless Pokemon going forward, we're going to have to keep Charon's Care in mind. So yes, while it is a little bit restrictive, I definitely like Charon's Care. I could easily see this popping up in colorless decks, especially since we have so many ways at searching this out, whether it's via Starbirth, the attack on Togekiss, cards like Inteleon and Drizzile, or even the new Lumineon V. Next up, we have what is one of the biggest slam dunks of the set. That's going to be Choice Belt. This is a card that the community has been frothing at the mouth to come back into the game. This is kind of a reprint of the very powerful Choice Band, but now for Pokemon V. So it's a tool card, and your attacks do 30 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon V. And of course, that does include Pokemon VSTAR and VMAX as well. This card basically helps every single archetype in the game without hurting single prize decks. And that's something we haven't seen in a while. Between this and the new Mana Fee, single prize decks in general are actually getting a big buff from Brilliant Stars and definitely are going to be in a much more competitive spot after this set drops. But also too, this is going to push a lot of attackers right in range of being able to take one-shots on Pokemon V-Star and even some Pokemon VMAX as well. Decks like Eternatus VMAX now actually have some ways between Choice Belt, Galarian Zigzagoons, Galarian Slowbro V at now reaching numbers to one-shot Pokemon VMAX. Similarly, other popular Pokemon V such as Ice Rider Calyrex now can push their damage output up to a range to one-shot Pokemon V-Star. Now, because of how strong this card is, we might start to have to think about running cards like Tool Scrapper, especially if the 30 damage does make a difference in terms of certain archetypes taking one-shots on your Pokemon. Choice Belt is absolutely one of the most impactful cards of this set, and I cannot praise this thing enough. One of the best cards in this set by far. Next up, we have Cleansing Gloves and Hunting Gloves, and honestly, it's like not even fair that we have to discuss these after Choice Belt, because Choice Belt basically just made all of these gimmicky gloves cards completely irrelevant. I'm so glad that Creatures finally caved in and was like, no one's using these dumb type exclusive glove cards or struggle gloves. Let's just give them Choice Belt. And as a result, these cards are pretty much trash. The only times you'd really want to use these are against non-Pokemon V, but usually non-Pokemon V are going to be single prize decks. And yeah, they usually have such low HP that it doesn't matter. So yeah, these cards are completely throwaway. Do not play them going forward. Just play Choice Belt. Next up, we have a new Stadium card that's going to be Collapsed Stadium. Each player can't have more than 4 benched Pokemon, but if a player has 4 or more benched Pokemon, they discard benched Pokemon until they only have 4 remaining. The player who plays the card discards first, and if there's more than one effect that is changing the number of benched Pokemon, use the smaller number. This is a very similar effect to several powerful stadiums we've had over the years, with of course the most notable ones being Giant Stump and more recently Parallel City. Now, Collapse Stadium isn't quite as impactful because this is only limiting your bench to 4, whereas those cards were limiting them to 3, but I definitely still think that can be impactful a lot of the time. So obviously this hurts decks like Eternatus VMAX, but even beyond that, a lot of decks right now are operating with a full bench. And not only can you use this as a disruption card, but you can also use this as a healing card by getting rid of maybe damaged Pokemon on your field, or even removing some of those low HP bench sitters like Crobat V, Lumineon V, etc. Decks like Mad Party, Lycanroc, or the new Wormadoms also can use this to discard Pokemon to fuel their attacks. So I think this is actually a very versatile Stadium card that we have here. And definitely could be among one of the contenders for decks that want a counter Stadium, but don't really have much else that synergizes particularly well with their deck. So thumbs up for me. Again, not quite as disruptive as some of its predecessors, but definitely still a playable card. Next up, we have Cynthia's Ambition. This is going to be a new supporter card that says draw until you have 5 cards in your hand. And if any of your Pokemon were knocked out during your opponent's last turn, draw until you have 8 instead. So this is a card that is right up my alley. This is definitely the type of card that I think single prize decks in particular will love to use, especially stage 2 decks. Realistically, if you're a multi-prize deck, you can only use these types of cards on very specific turns anyways, and at that point, just play Raihan. Raihan's usually going to be more impactful, but in the case of single prize decks where they need to see a ton of resources every turn, this is definitely going to be right up their alley, especially since they have so many turns that they can use a card like this. But going back to what I said about stage 2 decks, the reason I say this is so good for those decks decks is because very frequently you don't want to dump your hand and refill it with a card like Marnie or Research. Typically, you're going to have maybe a rare candy in hand or maybe your evolution, and Cynthia gives you the option of holding that and then refilling your hand to grab the other piece of the combo. Whereas again, a card like Professor's Research or even Bruno, which has a similar effect to this, isn't going to allow you to do such a thing. So again, probably not a card we're going to see pop up in your Zacian decks or your Rapid Strike Urshifu decks out there, but definitely for single prize decks, and with Ultra Ball also coming out in the same set to be able to more reliably play your hand down to a lower size, this supporter only gets better. So thumbs up for me on Cynthia. Again, it's only going to be used in certain decks, but it is very good in the types of decks that are looking for this effect. Next up, we have a new item card that's going to be Dry Seasoned Curry. So this says heal 40 damage from your active, but your active is now burned. So very confusing effect that we have here. We're going to heal ourselves, but then we're going to damage ourselves afterwards. So why would we play this? Well, I mean, obviously I think one of the first things you could do is you can heal 40, then you can switch to the bench and then come back to the active. And that's a way you can heal while not taking the burn damage. And then from there, I think the only other situations this could be good is if we're trying to inflict status conditions on ourselves. Like for example, there is a Galarian Slowbro that does 100 plus 120 more if it's affected by a special condition. So this definitely makes complete sense in a deck like that. But Galarian Slowbro, not probably the best card in the world. And as a result, I don't think there is much of a home for this Dry Seasoned Curry card currently. But if we do get some better Pokemon that want to be affected by special conditions or burn specifically, we maybe can revisit this. But I think just generally speaking, this card is going to be very low impact. But that being said, we do have another new healing card in the set. That's going to be Fresh Water Set. It's an item that says heal 20 damage from each of your Pokemon. And Freshwater Set is actually going to be a reprint from the same Freshwater Set card back all the way from Primal Clash. Back during that era of the game, Freshwater Set honestly really didn't see a whole lot of play. This is also back to when the tankiest Pokemon were capping out right over 200 HP. But Pokemon these days have much higher HP, do much higher damage, and I think just generally speaking, this 20 heal is not going to be too impactful. Now, there are some situations where this can be good. If we go against spread decks, for example, this can definitely be annoying for those to handle. And I think one of the only other uses I was able to see for this is maybe play this with the Gengar back from Sword and Shield. Gengar lets you move one damage counter from one of your Psychic Pokemon to another Psychic Pokemon. So let's say someone does 120, just as an easy example to your active. Well, you can move that damage around to your field in a way to where every Pokemon has 20 damage and then heal off all of that damage with this one item. But Gengar really hasn't been the best Pokemon, hasn't had many great partners. So I'm not super sold that that is going to be something that pops up. And just generally speaking, we have so many healing options that I think it's going to be difficult for Freshwater Set to compete with a lot of them. Next up, we have Gloria, which is another spiritual reprint that we're getting in this set. This one's a supporter card that says search your deck for up to 3 basic Pokemon that don't have a rule box and put them onto your bench, then shuffle your deck. This is almost identical to the old Bridget, and Bridget was a card that exploded in popularity after Tapu Lele GX was finally released. And in this set, we are getting Lumineon V, which does effectively the same thing as Tapu Lele. So I think a lot of people might look to Gloria and think this might be the next big setup supporter that we're going to use going forward. And even though I really do like this effect, this is especially good for those single prize decks that I love so much, but I do have some reservations. The first turn supporter rules are not as favorable to Gloria as they were towards Bridget. We cannot play supporters on the first turn of the game. And if we open with this, you're going to wish this thing was a quick ball or a battle VIP pass or something else. This card is basically only good on the first turn of the game if you're going second. And right now, Gloria has a lot to compete with. We have quick ball, ultra ball, level ball, Battle VIP Pass, Great Ball. And if we want to be able to find this on the first turn, we might have to play something like Lumineon V. And that might wind up being a potential liability if we are a single prize deck. It might force us to play something like a collapsed stadium or something if we want to keep it off of our field. Even though this is a great way at getting your field set up, I am going to keep my expectations in check a bit here. There's just a lot of issues that the card's going to have to overcome if it does want to see the same sort of widespread play that Bridget did. Next up, we have another supporter card. This is going to be Kindler. It says you can only use this card if you discard a fire energy card from your hand. But you look at the top 7 cards of your deck and put up to 2 of them in your hand, then shuffle the other cards back into your deck. So obviously this is looking to pair nicely with the new Magma Basin card. The idea is you can discard fire energy to get some cards from your deck and then use the new Magma Basin to accelerate that energy back into play. And while this effect isn't awful, I think this is probably just generally outclassed by other supporters that we have right now. Between cards like Quick Ball, Ultra Ball, Professor's Research, etc., I actually don't think it's going to be that hard to get fire energy in the discard pile. And if we're looking at the top 7 cards of our deck anyways, if we play Research, we can just get all of those cards. Now I know you don't have to discard your whole hand with Kindler, but more often than not, you're fine with it. Most every deck plays 4 copies of Research for a reason. Now that being said, I could maybe still see Kindler popping up in very low counts in select lists. This is kind of similar to a card called Bill's Analysis back from the Sun and Moon era, and while that was a generally lackluster card, it did eventually wind up seeing play in select decks. So there is a bit of long-term potential. I could even see lists maybe cutting like their 4th Marnie for a copy of Kindler to give them one extra out to a supporter that can discard energy. So while it's not unplayable by any means, I think it's just outclassed by better supporters that we have right now in the format. But speaking of fire support, up next we have what is going to be the glue that is holding fire decks together going forward. That is going to be the new Magma Basin Stadium card. This says once during each player's turn, that player may attach a fire energy card from their discard pile to one of their benched fire Pokemon. If a player attached energy to a Pokemon this way, put 2 damage counters on that Pokemon. Ever since Welder rotated, fire Pokemon have been struggling, but all that is set to change with Magma Basin coming into the game. I think this is especially going to be good with fire Pokemon that attack for 2 energy. Because very frequently, if your opponent knocks out your only attacker that has any energy, on your next turn, you can go Magma Basin and attach from hand and be ready to go. Now, you can still cheat an additional 3rd energy in a play if you have something like Raihan, but I think generally speaking, Magma Basin is most going to benefit cards like NTV, Victini VMAX, etc., more so than some of those 3 and 4 energy-based attackers out there. But that being said, this is still definitely going to help cards like the new Charizard VSTAR that we looked at earlier in this set review, maybe even the old Charizard VMAX as well, we'll have to see. And I'm actually curious to see what happens in Expanded with this. I'm really not factoring that into my score too much here, but now in Expanded, people can go Magma Basin, Blacksmith or Welder, and a manual attachment to get a 4 energy attacker powered up in a single turn. So I'm very curious to see what players do in that format, but even in Standard, this card definitely is looking to be very, very good. Next up, we have a card we already kind of discussed a little bit. That's going to be Marnie's Pride. So this is the card we discussed back with more Peko V that says attach a basic energy card from your discard to one of your benched Pokemon. Overall, this is very, very weak. The only time you would ever really want to play this is if you're playing this with more Peko. I think generally speaking, you would just really prefer to play Raihan in most instances. I know Raihan does limit you to only playing it on the turns that something was knocked out, but Raihan lets you attach your energy to any Pokemon and allows you to search your deck for any card in the process. And I think it's just going to vastly outshine Marnie's Pride. You know, if we didn't have cards like Raihan, Melanie, or even Bede, then we would have to take this card more seriously, but for the moment, our other options are just much better than this card. Next up, we have Pot Helmet. This is another Pokemon tool card, and it's kind of going to be like the inverse of Choice Belt, but unfortunately is nowhere near as impactful. So this thing says, if the Pokemon this card is attached to doesn't have a rule box, it takes 30 less damage from attacks from your opponent's Pokemon. But of course, the issue here is that non-rule box Pokemon usually have such low HP as it is, to where this 30 reduction doesn't really matter when every attacker in the game is already hitting over 200. Realistically, I think this would have needed to be closer to like a 60 reduction, and even at that point, I think we would still even question if this card is good. Next up, we have a new recovery supporter. That's going to be Roseanne's Backup. This thing says choose one or more, shuffle a Pokemon from your discard pile into your deck, shuffle a Pokemon tool card from your discard pile into your deck, shuffle a stadium card from your discard into your deck, and or shuffle an energy from your discard into your deck. Okay, so this is actually a pretty powerful effect here for a few reasons. Pokemon recovery is a dime a dozen. There's plenty of ways at retrieving Pokemon, but all these other cards are usually much more difficult to get back. With Pokemon tools, right now, the only way we really have at getting these back are going to be with a card like Gramble. Stadium cards basically have no playable way of being retrieved. And also, maybe more importantly, special energy cards have no way at really being retrieved right now. So Roseanne's could in theory become your 5th Double Turbo energy, your 5th Fusion Strike energy, your 5th Path to the Peak. But as you can tell by my rating, I am still a little bit conflicted on Roseanne's. I know we can search this out with Lumineon V on the turns that we need it, but I do worry about this card being a little bit too slow. Not only are we taking a turn off of playing a draw supporter like Research or Marnie, but also these are going into your decks. So we need to find a turn where not only do we not need a draw supporter for turn, but we need to recover cards, but we also don't necessarily need them on that turn. So you see what I'm saying? I think the window in a match that you're free to play a card like Roseanne's is going to be very, very narrow. But maybe decks that do have alternate draw engines like Genesect V, or maybe decks that are running the new by Barrel, could be eyeing this down just because they can mitigate that lack of draw power with their powerful support Pokemon that they have in play. So I actually really do like this card. I think its home is a little bit unclear for the moment, but I think there are going to be decks that are going to want to play a card like this, especially since it provides recovery options for so many cards for which there are none currently. For our final supporter card of the set review, we're going to look at Team Yell's Cheer. You shuffle up to 3 of any combination of Pokemon and supporter cards, except Team Yell's Cheer, from your discard into your deck. So while I think at a glance, this looks like a very slow card, and it is, don't get it misconstrued, this is most going to benefit control decks out there. So if we are playing something like the new Floatzel as an example, and then other disruptive supporter cards like Team Yell Grunt, Flannery, Boss's Orders, etc., we're going to be able to recycle these cards over and over. And if we're playing multiple copies of Team Yell's Cheer and Pal Pad, every time we play a Pal Pad, that's basically going to get us back any 6 combination of Pokemon and supporter cards. And that's huge. So between this Pal Pad, Floatzel, even Roseanne's backup that we just looked at, and all of the disruption cards that we have access to, it's looking more and more like we have the means of being able to loop these disruption effects turn after turn to ideally control our opponent's board and eventually deck them out. I've said this before, but I'm not a big control player, so I'm probably not the authority figure to look to here if you want to know any more specific thoughts on this card, but we absolutely do face the possibility of control making a return after Brilliant Stars comes out. For our final item card of the set review, we could not have picked a better note to go out on. We have Ultra Ball. Ultra Ball is a reprint of one of the honestly greatest item cards of all time. It says discard 2 cards from your hand. If you do, search your deck for a Pokemon, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle your deck. So just think Quick Ball, but you discard 1 extra card, and now suddenly you can grab your VMAXs, your V-Stars, your normal single prize evolutions, whatever it might be. Basically, every deck gets better as a result of Ultra Ball. I think some single prize decks might be disproportionately less positively impacted just because they usually have fewer expendable resources. But nevertheless, Ultra Ball is an incredible card. And as you guys know, with Quick Ball being in the format, so many decks want cards in the discard, whether it's Mad Party, dark decks that play Galarian Moltres, etc. And on top of that, we have other cards like Crobat V and by Barrel that want to lower their hand size to be able to draw more cards from deck, and Ultra Ball is another way at helping enable that. This is absolutely one of the best cards in the set, easily top 3. Make sure you get a playset of this. Almost every deck is going to be using it. And for the final card of the set review, we have Double Turbo Energy, the only special energy that we're getting in this set. So this thing says, as long as this is attached to a Pokemon, it provides 2 colorless energy, but the attacks of the Pokemon this card is attached to do 20 less damage to your opponent's Pokemon. But I don't think that's going to be enough to stop this card from being good. Obviously, I think one of the big partners for this is going to be Arceus VSTAR, and even in that case, I don't think the damage reduction really matters. If you're going against a Pokemon VSTAR or Pokemon VMAX, going from 200 to 180 doesn't really change the number of attacks you need to hit them with. And Double Turbo Energy is still really good in other decks that place damage counters instead of doing direct damage. Think of the new Mimikyu VMAX that places damage counters and isn't affected by this 20 damage reduction. But one of the things I'm most excited about for this new card is going to be the treasure trove of single prize decks we can play this with. After the rotation of Triple Acceleration Energy last year, a lot of single prize decks just kind of fell off the face of the earth because they didn't frankly have enough energy to be able to fill out their deck. Think of a deck like Mad Party, the Salazzle Weepinbell deck, even mill cards like the Toxtricity or the Grass type Durant. And I am really excited to dust off some of these old single prize decks now that they have Double Turbo Energy, they have Choice Belt, they have Manaphy. I really do think we could see a resurgence in these single prize decks after Brilliant Stars releases. So while it's not as over the top broken as the old Double Colorless Energy was, this is still an absolutely fantastic card and is definitely going to see play even despite its damage reduction. And with that, we finally made it to the end of my Brilliant Stars set review. YouTube's analytics do show me that not everyone does make it to the end of some of these longer form videos. So if you guys are here, give yourselves a pat on the back. I appreciate you making it this far into this thing. But before we close out this video, just want to go over some of my overall thoughts on this set as a whole. The big takeaway from the set, of course, though, is going to be the introduction of the new Pokemon VSTAR cards. And I really do like the direction that they are taking these things. We're finally getting away from Pokemon with 300 plus HP, so I'm definitely on board with that. This set also gives a big buff buff to fire Pokemon, thanks of course to the new Magma Basin Stadium card. We'll see if Charizard winds up making a dent in the game, but it's just nice to know that this type finally is going to be able to be played again. But I think one of the best things about the set is the sheer amount of consistency cards. I'm mainly looking at Lumineon V, the new by Burrell, and of course Ultra Ball as well. And kind of on that same note, one of the things I love most about Brilliant Stars is the buff that single prize decks are going to get. So I just mentioned by Burrell, but on top of that, we're getting the new Mana Fee to protect our bench, Choice Belt to do more damage to Pokemon V, and Double Turbo Energy is going to help out a lot of these long forgotten decks that have fallen out of favor. Now, if there is anything I would complain about in this set, that's really the quality of the Pokemon VMAX. This is kind of right now looking to be their last hurrah, and the last ones that we're seeing printed are definitely really underwhelming. But that being said, I think Brilliant Stars helps out really any deck in the format. Of course, single prize decks like I mentioned, but also two prize decks and even the VMAX decks that are still lingering in the format. And in terms of score, I am going to give Brilliant Stars a 5 out of 5. I think Brilliant Stars looks to be one of the best sets that we've seen in the entire Sword and Shield era. But of course, we looked at a ton of stuff today, and no doubt your opinions are going to differ a bit from mine. So let me know down below in the comment section, what cards are you looking forward to? Are there any cards you thought I was maybe a little bit too harsh on? Any you maybe thought I gave a little bit too much credit to? Let me know your full thoughts down below in the comment section. But if you did enjoy today's video, be sure to smack that like button. And if you're feeling a little bit extra generous, you can always become a patron at patreon.com/rarecandytcg or pick up some merch at rarecandytcg.com. I'll have links down below in the description. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.